Thank you. Incredibly rich and complex and series of papers and statements. We have 45 minutes, more or less, for questions and comments and commentary of various kinds. So let me throw things open. We also have microphones on either side, so if people have things to say, that please wait for that to arrive.
And I'll just throw in as well as our translators will once again be translating. We'll give them a moment just to translate after each question.
David? Yes, you definitely need a microphone.
Hola. Sure. Thank you so much, the panel. That was
Harriet.
Sorry.
And then David.
Thank you so much, the panel. That was just such an exciting opening to this. I had a question for Julia. I really love A Poem Is Being Written, and I've spent a lot of time writing about it, but really struggle with getting to grips with it. But one of the things I find fascinating about it is that opening where she talks about how she could only write this in a space of, I think it's hyper-conscious professionalism and virtuosity. And I was thinking, how do you think about that in terms of like that framing around masochism, but also how do you think about things like shame that she's writing about in that period?
Yeah, thank you. Right, I mean, I think it seems, one of the things that it seems to me is happening in the essay is that one of the ways that she is sort of enjoying herself is by pointing to her display of her own virtuosity, which is to me the sort of like masochism versus sadomasochism thing, where she's like, look at me, basically like showing off my, should I have waited till the...
No, sorry.
Okay. Yeah, I think that she's making fun of herself for being so good at what she's doing and for showing off, I think. So something like shame, she's trying to take her pride as an opportunity for shame, I think. And she's trying to sort of take her display of how good a writer she is as a kind of, by making fun of herself for it, as I think she does in that opening. She's sort of arming us with it as a way to poke fun at her, I think, and that she's doing it to herself. And at the same time, I guess what I'm suggesting is that there's a thing she's sort of making sure not ever exactly to acknowledge, which is the ways in which even what a good essayist she is fails. So yeah, so I think it is part of that dialectic.
Thank you all of you for those, Tim's word, rich, extraordinarily rich and different approaches to the question. I'm going to try and ask a question that speaks to all three, if I might. But I was struck, first of all, Anne-Garetta, but by the fact that you began something of a historical assessment by telling us, pointing back to a series of transformations of the matricial space, and suggested that they were continuing and that this was a matter of repetitions with difference over a long period of time, going back to Proust if we want, going back to Dubovsky if we want, and so on. And then Julia Jaco, you fixed on a moment, right, which was Sedgwick's form of auto theory before the event, in a sense. So once again, a step back into a historical moment. So my question for both of you, I guess, would be, given what you said, would anything have been different if there had never been an auto in the discussion. If there had never been any reference, given that you, Anne-Garita, you tried to give us a sense of the complexity of what we presume to be the singular concept of the I. So do we need to presume that that the word needed to be uttered? Do we need to think that even in Sedgwick's case, that the I, which is not foregrounded, right, as you outlined so clearly, is it still a necessary element? And then in contrast with that, Gabriela Wiener, thank you very much for the way in which you showed us a very different complexity of writing practices, which came to your conclusion in terms of a type of action, right, that I understood to be a communal action that was somehow, if you like, going beyond a singular I. So would it be your intention that what you call action at the end of your talk is an action without an I, without a subject necessarily performing that as a singular instance? I'll let any of you answer in any way you wish.
I think that what Gabriela Wiener's reading showed us is not the question of who the subject is or what is supposed to be this or that subject. Its presupposition of existence, its presupposition of consistency is who gets to write, i.e. to inscribe, and to leave a trace, and to have traces counted. And I was struck by something, and it's not a rejoinder, Gabriela. It's something which I think is important to understand if we want to make any sort of move towards some form of recognition, emancipation, or to stop some of the violence. I'd like to disabuse you of the notion that Annie Ernaux is universally recognized or acknowledged as literature. Proof of it is when she got the Nobel Prize in Literature, you had an outpouring of reactionary violence against her in the French press, saying, no, this is not literature. This is just the scribblings of a woman recounting her daily life, and there's nothing aesthetic and there's nothing literary about it. So Annie Ernaux might be white, which is, I grant, a privilege and an asset. But there are three problems with her. Number one, she's a woman. It counts for something against her. Number two, she's from a working class background. And this should not be minimized. And number three, she's identified with the radical left, i.e., presumably the people for whom the question of who counts as a voice, as a body, or a subject is still a question and has not been foreclosed in a dynamics or a matrix of domination. And so in the French press, Annie Ernaux, just Nobel Prize, was entirely discounted. So the question is not simply who counts or not counts. It's indeed the question who counts, does the counting, and the accounting to acknowledge that something or someone counts. So there's a double version to that. And I truly believe that this rewiring of the matrix around the question of autofiction, auto-theory, or even earlier than that, in the logic of the essay, say, for example, in Montaigne, or in the logic of Rousseau, who again was certainly a man in white, but he had zero status in the society in which he was writing. He was an orphan, he was an outcast, he was a non-citizen, he was a nomad, exile, migrating across the borders in Europe in the middle of winter because he had been thrown out. Okay? So each time the question is, and in this type of thing, what is the auto? How can I count and be made to count while I'm still counting? So the auto is exactly that, the double face of the counting and of the account. And it is not settled once and for all, and it continues being a locus of struggle, a locus of oppositions, and no status is ever acquired. No position should ever be acquired in that. And it's pretty clear to me, at least in the case of Roland Barthes, that what Death of the Author indexes in 1968 is a total upheaval in the parameters of identity and signature. It comes out in 68 out of the seminar that Barthes held on Sarrazin de Balzac, and was the entire question of sexual difference, of castration, of what counts as a man, what counts as a woman, is in fact the core topic. And this is held exactly in the year where, for the first time in France, women get or acquire the right to sign a check, to sign a contract, without asking for the authorization of their husband. What it means is the death of the author simply registers the tectonic shift in the social and political construction of what counts as signature. So these are not abstract formal questions. These are not ontological questions of literature, form, genre, poetics, narratology. These are social and political questions. They're not closed, and each time we need to rewrite the matrix of this circulation between a first-person subject, a body, a social location, a world, and an apparatus of perception. This is my I'm a bit vehement there. It's because I truly believe it's the case.
Bueno, creo que lo que Ana ha querido decir es que los franceses, etcétera, etcétera.
I think that what Anne is saying is that the French, et cetera, et cetera.
The French.
Una vez en un programa de televisión me preguntaron cosas sobre la lengua, creo. Sobre la lengua española y el encuentro con Latinoamérica y el maravilloso mestizaje. Y obviamente empezamos a hablar, bueno, estábamos hablando de mi libro, en fin. Pero obviamente pues salió todo el tema de extranjería, de fronteras, inmigración. Los temas caen por su propio peso. Había la presidenta del sindicato de trabajadoras del hogar en Madrid, una salvadoreña. Sí.
Okay. So once in a television program, I was asked things about Spanish language and about the encounter with Latin America and questions of mestizaje. We've been speaking here about Gabriela's book, Walker Retrato, or portraits where themes of foreignness, etc., come to the fore.
Estaba la presidenta de la Asociación de Trabajadoras del Hogar salvadoreña, y esta señora que estaba ahí, una mujer española como subdirectora, perdón, del diario El Mundo, me escuchó hablar de las colas de extranjería y me dijo que la ley era la ley para todo el mundo y que su marido francés también había hecho colas.
So the president of the Domestic Workers Union in Spain, who is a Salvadoran woman, was talking about labor practices and assurances, and the vice president of the Spanish newspaper El Mundo came forth and said, my husband, who is French, has also suffered difficulties.
Por supuesto, Annie Ernaux es un referente para las escritoras latinoamericanas que hemos escrito sobre el yo en primera persona, como lo han sido Vivian Gornick o Joan Didion. Sobre todo que
And so Annie Ernaux is also a referent for Latin American female writers who have been writing the literature of the I, as are also Vivian Gornick and Joan Didion.
para llegar a cuestionarnos el hecho de que ese es esos son los libros que han circulado entre nosotras como representantes de la literatura del yo, evidentemente hay que introducir la perspectiva anticolonial, es decir, por qué nos llegan sobre todo los libros de las escritoras del norte global, ¿no?
Okay, so she points out that as these have been a referent for Latin American writers writing today, that we need to question how these works are circulating amongst us and how to translate alongside them the anti-colonial question.
Cuando hablo de la acción, me refiero primero claramente a lo que mueve, moviliza en el mundo que estas escritoras que he mencionado, a las que he relacionado con la palabra coacción, no habían dicho hasta ahora.
So when she's talking about action, she is thinking about what mobilizes these female writers who come from a position of coacción, blackmail, oppression, being at a series of different impossible junctures.
Ni habían sido escritas, ni habían sido publicadas, ni habían sido circuladas, y mucho menos podrían aspirar a ganar un premio Nobel.
And they hadn't been read, they hadn't been translated, they hadn't been circulated, they weren't in a position to be considered for the Nobel Prize.
Sí, desde luego me refiero a la acción comunitaria, cuando hablo de que esas escrituras no son solo individuales y que cuando la autoficción es acosada, perseguida constantemente en su generalidad por tratarse del yo, ¿no? Hablamos de otras voces y de otras subjetividades nuevas que aparecen, inesperadas, y que de repente no tienen que ver con nada, ni mucho menos individualista, ¿no?
And so when she's talking about action, as David Wills was pointing out towards the end of the talk, she's absolutely talking about a community of writers. She's talking about other voices and other subjectivities that need to be brought into the conversation.
Digamos que cuando hacemos literatura, escritura y también cuando hacemos, cuando nos hacemos escuchar una voz crítica o política, estamos performando.
And then when we're participating in these conversations, when we're channeling different voices, different subjectivities, we are of course performing.
El yo en la escritura tiene estos, digamos, difuerzos, no sé cómo se dice, estos giros divertidos, a veces cautivadores, políticos, provocadores muchas veces.
And so the I in writing, of course, enjoys these kinds of twists and turns and performances and provocations.
Que cuando leí mi poema, dije, Europa, les disparas en tus colonias, y también dije Estados Unidos. Es una operación constante en mi escritura, que tiene que ver con de pronto hacer algo así, algo que me deja en una situación de vulnerabilidad, pero que también es algo político, tomando en cuenta este contexto, esta mesa, este país, etc. Me faltó al final nada más decir España, Europa, Estados Unidos, ten un poco de decencia, ¿no? Que te cambian los pañales, estas mujeres.
So when she read her poem, Panchilandia, which is from the English translation of Waka Retrato by Julia Sanchez, She calls out Spain, she calls out the United States, that this is a constant in her writing, this political pushback against forces that are invisibilizing Latin American writers or writers from the Global South. And she would like to have added in at the end of the poem, as she's done in another version, instead of simply Spain, have some decency, also Spain, Europe, the United States, have some decency.
No es casual que voces, ya lo decía, que no se han escuchado nunca, cuando salen se parecen mucho a los gritos.
And it's not surprising then that sometimes when we do get to speak that it comes out as a scream.
Y tampoco es raro que justamente cuando esas voces se hacen escuchar por primera vez, aparezcan las personas que no estaban acostumbradas a oír esas voces ni ese atrevimiento y te intenten neutralizar.
And it's also the case that people are not perhaps used to hearing these shouts and these screams and aren't sure what to do with them.
La acción no deja de ser algo físico, obviamente, es algo cuerpo, además de idea política, pero es estar aquí, o sea, parte de la acción es estar aquí, es estar ahí, es estar en lo que escribes, que esté tu nombre, que esté tu voz, que estés diciendo una serie de cosas que a veces no son tan gratas de escuchar.
And so action is physical, of course, but it's also about being here, it's about being there, it's being in writing, it's about saying things that don't necessarily want to be heard.
Y bueno, nada, traje esta camiseta.
And she's wearing a t-shirt that says,
Bueno, ya no me
Oh.
mires tanto las tetas.
your theory doesn't have enough. There's not enough street in your theory.
Hello. Okay. I have a question for Anna Garreta, but I think can maybe also be one that we expand to everyone. I was really trying to think through the conclusion of your presentation where you bring out this draft of Bobrovsky's writing and the idea that autofiction is a sort of vehicle, that language is a vehicle. And then at the same time that there is this type of like accelerationist, mechanical vehicularity in modern life that is separating the subject and that is causing problems and is causing this destabilization. And so I was trying to think through how the vehicle that is language is, if it is any different from these other technological vehicles, or if you have a different understanding of language as a vehicle that could be stabilizing. And I think in these other presentations, we also have this kind of, inherent question in the auto and writing of what is it carrying with us, and whose voices are we giving. But I think specifically, I'm trying to think through if there is not also this kind of threat of language to be destabilizing in the way that a train crash is or an automobile.
Yeah, I think it's a difficult question. I don't have an answer to it. I'm sorry. But I have more questions that have to do more with the uses of language. And I think it's a question that stems from the position that Gabriella is taking here, which is the position of calling out or the position of screaming. What can we expect from certain uses of language? What kind of operativity, what kind of effect do they have? And I don't know that it's been very properly mapped. I don't know that I have an answer to how to translate the voice into something which is politically operative and not simply a moral remonstration or an ethical band-aid on a gaping political and economical wound. So that's my issue. And that goes back to a very old question, which has always been what do writers, the people who are either artists or studying literature or building something around literature with literature, what can they expect or what can they hope to achieve with whatever means they have encountered within the field of quantitative aesthetics? There are classical answers to this.
I'm sorry. And can you talk
Yeah,
more
yes,
directly?
please.
She's saying, can you speak more directly into the mic?
Okay. So there are classical answers to this. I don't know that the classical answers are still valid for today. What I know is that we cannot trust simply in speech or language as is to accomplish whatever we hope to do politically.
Hola. Hi. I have a question for Gabriela. Michelle, do you want me to? I will ask it in Spanish. You want to translate?
Sure.
Gracias. Bueno, gracias, Gabriela. Thank you all of you for being here today. I will have a specific question for Gabriela, coming myself from Latin American Studies and Contemporary Literature. Gabriela, una pregunta para ti. Entiendo, escucho en tu voz muchas cosas, muchos matices. O sea, un grito también visceral, ¿no? Pues de dolor, de reivindicación, de muchas reivindicaciones.
Do you want to translate actually
Okay,
as
I
you're
will
going
try.
along? That would be
Yeah, so I can hear I'm not sure if I translate properly, but so I can hear in your voice like different levels and nuances of pain, reivindication, suffering. And I have I have two questions for you. Tengo dos preguntas para ti. La primera es cómo, o sea, entiendo que hay como no sé si es equilibrio, pero como que hay aquí muchos aspectos que intervienen, ¿no? A la hora de escribir o también de presentar aquí. So I understand there are different aspects that can come into your writing, or also when you come here and present your work, which are los cuales son militancia, por un lado, ficción, autoficción, performance y desobediencia también, ¿no? So performance, militancy, fiction, autofiction, and the fact that you are disobeying, right? Entonces, y me pregunto cómo se consigue un poco el equilibrio, si es un equilibrio entre todo eso. And I'm wondering about how do you balance all these different aspects. My other question is, estás hablando de esta generación de escritoras mujeres y de distintas voces que se juntan en una forma de coacción. You're talking about a generation, like a rising generation of female writers from Latin America who are putting together their voices to increase the volume and make these voices finally to be able to be listened by the readers. Pero entonces la pregunta es, una vez que ustedes llegan a este nivel de visibilidad, de denuncia, de desobediencia, ¿qué es lo que queda por decir? So once you achieve this level of visibility, popularity, being translated into several languages, being read by audiences from different countries in the world, once you put your voices together in this co-action, what remains to be recounted?
Gracias. Yo creo que si siguiera hablando de esto, se agotaría por hoy. Quiero decir, estoy a punto de ya convertirme en insoportable, entonces estoy al límite. Es lo mismo en la escritura también. Si hay algo con lo que escribimos es con, no sé cómo se llama, pero algún herramienta de laboratorio que controla las dosis de las cosas. Y hay que, no sé, creo que uno desarrolla el olfato y casi siempre que te has sentido acorralado, eso se agudiza. ¿Sí? ¿O sigo?
Sí,
Ah.
Latin America.
Y también hay que hacer la diferencia entre lo que es un activismo que se hace aprovechando, no sé, el otro día estaba en Bruselas, rodeada de banderas azules con estrellas blancas en la Feria del Libro, y claro, no me iba a poner a hablar de mi padre y la poesía de Guaco Retrato. Así que aproveché el espacio. Creo que aquí pues he tratado de dosificarme en mi lectura. Ahora otra cosa son los turnos de pregunta. ¿Ya?
No, I'll just step in with this, just to translate the first part of this. So, Gabriele said, so this theme that she is on the verge of becoming unbearable. So she is apologizing for this in advance, but she is talking about having laboratory tools that basically control how much of something gets expressed in a certain context. That she was recently, and thinking about what needs to be expressed in certain contexts. So she was very recently at a book fair in Brussels, surrounded by blue flags with white, yellow stars on them, which made it impossible for her to talk about some of the personal aspects of her book, Undiscovered, because it was more important for her to talk about the political aspects of the book and questions of, for instance, questions of migration.
He escuchado una frase parecida de alguien que leyó un libro de una escritora latinoamericana muy visceral, muy escrito desde las tripas, y me hizo un comentario como, esta escritura lo que pasa es que, claro, es potentísima, pero me pregunto, después de esto, ¿de qué más va a escribir? ¿No? Creo que el comentario de la frase de Angélica Lidl es muy precisa, ¿no? Después de escribir de una misma, ¿ya qué? ¿No? Esa especie de arte de de autoconsumirte, ¿no? En la experiencia de contarte, ¿no? Algo que por otro lado está muy ligado al arte, ¿no? Y a las artistas del cuerpo, ¿no? Tiene que ver con algo muy límite y con una experiencia muy salvaje que coquetea también con la desaparición. Pero esa tensión, eso latente, no deja ese límite, esa frontera, no deja de ser explorada. No creo que se agote.
So responding to Erica's question about once this has been told and once the Latin American female writers of her generation, or migrant writers perhaps more broadly, have received a certain level of visibility, what is there left to write about? And she says this is precisely the limit where we need to keep playing. She's quoting Angelica Little, who was also quoted in her text, saying when one has written about the self, what else is there to write about? But is insisting that this is the edge that we need to keep playing at.
Entonces está esta experiencia un poco kamikaze, ¿no? Suicida del hecho de la escritura también. O sea, hay casos completamente verificables de que realmente esas vidas se extinguieron, o las masacraron, o las invisibilizaron, las desaparecieron, o se suicidaron, que es lo mismo que matarlas. Sobre todo tratándose de escritoras. Aún así, creo que ya cuando yo siento que, y lo estamos viendo, desde que una mujer y otra y otra y otra empezaron a sumar sus voces y a elevar el volumen, han pasado, bueno, de esta nueva ola, han pasado pocos años, pero ya en este momento podemos ver consecuencias que creo que responden perfectamente a tu pregunta. Hay muchas mujeres que ahora se han callado. Ahora hay muchas mujeres que callan porque el nivel de acoso, desde luego si hasta una premio Nobel la tratan así, ¿qué podemos esperar las demás? Y sí, muchas al final terminan
So there
bajando
are
la voz.
I'm sorry, that there are still many writers, there are still many female writers, there are still many women who are silent, who are being silenced, who are being disappeared, who disappear through different acts of violence. And she points again to the French writer Annie Ernaux, but this time pointing out that if the French literary establishment is treating a Nobel Prize winner in this way, that it's a clearer argument for continuing to raise the voice.
Por supuesto, mis ambiciones cuando escribo un libro, cuando lo publico, son un poco más mm, grandes, amplias que la aspiración que tengo hoy de hablar sobre algún tema o de incidir en algún tema político. Quiero decir que el formato libro permite, ¿no? Otras temperaturas, otras armonías, permite la armonía. Permite la voz baja, el susurro, el silencio, que a veces es mucho más poderosamente de denuncia que un grito. Pero claro, si ahora me quedo en silencio, a ver qué pasa.
So she's pointing out that her books, of course, also have a larger ambition, and that they try out a range of different topics and subjects and tones that go from the shout down to the murmur and the whisper and to silence as well. And that we need to be able to listen to that variety of tones within the text.
We just have two more questions, and then we'll break. Maybe if you could keep them, Annabelle and what's your name?
My name is Rochelle.
Rochelle, thank you. And
Thank you. Thank you for your talks. I'll keep this brief. My question is concerning the stuff of the eye, its transmission, the material or the phenomenon of that. As I noticed in each of your talks, that there is a distinct association with the rhythm in which the eye is transmitted in each of the pieces that you addressed. And I did get this idea initially suggested by Anne when she talked about the groove, which I imagined to be the groove of the vinyl record. And in Anne's case, it almost seemed to be that the déjà vu was the locked groove, which is a technology that occurs at the end of a record, which keeps the record from stopping. It will continue at the end to keep going. In Julia's talk, it seemed to be that there was some kind of beat matching at play, in which the spanking was sort of the representation of the rhythm of desire, and the mimesis between those two. And lastly, in Gabrielle's, I seem to notice a skipping in the vinyl, in which she quotes, "Never stop so we can start." And I wondered if you all might mind addressing this, what's at stake in this idea of the material eye and how it's transmitted in the rhythm. What is imprinted in this idea of the rhythm? Is there subjectivity, and that's what accounts for the differentiation between the way that these eyes are represented, or the phenomena of their material representation? In how the eye is played in all of your examples. And thank you.
Julia, why don't you start?
Sure. Thanks, Rochelle. I guess my first thought, right, so Sedgwick writes about enjambment and the sort of rhythm of the lyric as a kind of imitation of spanking, of the rhythmicity of spanking. You know, I guess for me, it's like the phrase material or materiality tends to come up most usefully in contrast to a sort of like, you know, negation of the material. There's some way that like writing keeps doing this thing where it's sort of in speaking or elaborating on you know, the material or the real, or like sex, let's say, of whatever kind, it simultaneously derealizes it and then like introduces a new scene in which the real can yet again intervene. And that's the sort of dynamic I'm trying to describe. So I guess I would say the groove is like necessarily metaleptic in the structure that I'm talking about. The distinction between the material and the abstract or the conceptual is necessary. Like you have to have that distinction, but you also have to keep being able to like overturn it and then reestablish it.
Maybe we could just hear from Annabelle, and then other things that other people would like to say in response to the Rochelle's question.
Sure, because I actually think my question is similar to Rochelle's, because I was so struck by how wildly different the inflections of the first person were in all of your talks. I felt like it was maybe as different as like a Chihuahua is from a boxer from an Irish Wolfhound, or maybe like Snoop Dogg from Snoopy from a hot dog. And so the question for me was, what does it mean that we still want to gather these first-person inflections under the sign of the I? So that was my question for the panel. But I actually had a question for you, Michelle, because I was really struck that when you were translating, you turned the I into a she, and I was wondering why you did that.
I have to jump in and actually speak as myself here. I'm thinking of what David was saying in his opening remarks about the mask and sometimes the steel of the mask that bites into the face. So I'm feeling maybe that a little bit at the moment. So I think it's important to point out that what I'm representing is a translation of what Gabriella is saying rather than voicing my own opinions on this. So I think it's the translator establishing a difference.
And would people like to comment on the difference of the eyes? I think it's a superb question, Annabelle. I was thinking the same as well and trying to get my head around that.
There's a difference because the I is an empty container for whatever it is we're going to pour into it. The I belongs to no one. It's not the property of anyone. It comes, not always, but most often devoid of properties. And it is quite strange that you should have something that is so underdeterminate in language. And its undeterminacy is what allows it to be seized by anyone. That's a basic element. The thing is that, of course, this is what is theoretical or potential in language. In reality and indeed in actuality, what we know is not everyone has been able or has been put in the capacity or has been allowed to say I at every moment, in every circumstances and in every context. So we should not fault the language. We should fault certain uses of language which become solidified, ossified, and which produce inequal results. But if within a parameter or presupposition of inequality, what we're going to encounter is not the identity of all of the I's, but simply the differences because they're inscribed differently in the world. I mean, that's trivial in a way. I don't know how to account for it more precisely than that. It's pretty trivial. It's a framework within which we're working. So the differences between the I and not the I's here are not surprising. We don't come from the same places. We don't live exactly in the same world, in the same languages, at the same intersections. We don't necessarily cross the same borders. We're not contained by the same borders. The question is, how do we manage to talk across these differences? Is there the possibility of a minimal understanding and a minimal co-action in terms of what writing does, in terms of reading and writing, which is the basis for our presence here together today and possibly tomorrow. As for the rest, it might be above our pay grade.
Okay. That's a great note to end on. We are, I think, I mean, the questions that have been raised around the historicity of our question, I think continues. All three papers grappled with that. They located it in different at different moments in relationship to different thinkers, and the lack of consistency of the eye also takes different forms in these different papers. So I think we remain with a huge amount to talk about. Let's thank our speakers, and we reconvene at 2:30.